For most of my life, if somebody told me that stress was causing health problems, and specifically in my marriage as well, I would have rolled my eyes. In fact, that's exactly what I did. I grew up believing that stress was just part of life. Everybody has stress, everybody has problems, everybody has responsibilities. So when doctors started telling me that some of my health problems were stress related, I didn't buy it, not for 1 second. I thought it was just a convenient answer, a catch all excuse, something that doctors say when they can't figure out the real problem. But when I look back at it, I was completely wrong. Before my marriage, I was about as healthy as they come. I've always been active. I've always worked physically demanding jobs. You know, I was never the guy sitting behind a desk all day. I was moving, working, building things, living life. I rarely got sick. I had energy. I was strong. And honestly, I never spent much time thinking about my health because there wasn't really much to think about. But during that marriage, things started happening. My blood pressure went up, and I mean way up. I developed acid reflux. I started dealing with anxiety, started dealing with depression. And none of it made sense to me because in my mind, I was still the same person. The doctors kept saying the same thing. You need to reduce your stress. And every time they said it, I basically dismissed it. Yeah, okay, doc. And, everybody has stress. That's life. And, I thought they were full of crap. The funny thing is, I wasn't a medication guy either. I'm still not. I won't even take an aspirin for a headache. But, when I broke my back, the doctors even got frustrated with me because I kept refusing the pain medication that they wanted me to take. But eventually, I ended up on blood pressure medication and I ended up on acid reflux medication. Not because I wanted them, but because I needed those. Those weren't optional, those were necessary. The anxiety and the depression, I just suffered through those. And, because I figured that's what men do: keep moving, keep working, keep pushing. So that's exactly what I did. And all the while, the doctors kept telling me the same thing: stress, 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 stress. And every time they said it, I ignored it. Because I thought they were giving me an excuse instead of an answer. Then something happened. I left the marriage. I left the chaos. I left the constant criticism. I left the walking on eggshells. I left the turmoil. I left the stress that had become normal. And here's where the story gets interesting. You know, Before things got better, they got worse. Not long after leaving, I developed heart problems, real heart problems, the kind that get your attention. The kind that make you start wondering if you're even going to be around much longer. The kind that make you realize that you're not nearly as bulletproof as you thought you were. And honestly, there were moments during that period where I wasn't sure how it was even going to end. That was a rough ride, a very rough ride. But over time, something started happening. You know, as the chaos left my life, my body started changing too. My blood pressure improved. The acid reflux disappeared, gone. And the heart issues disappeared. You know, they the constant stress started disappearing. The anxiety got better. Depression is really not even a thing now. And eventually, I had to admit something that I didn't want to admit. They were right. The entire time, I just wasn't ready to hear it. In fact, as I stand here talking to you today, I don't have a single medication in my body. Not one. And I haven't for at least 6 months. No blood pressure medications, no acid reflux medications, nothing. My vitals are good, my checkups are good. And the weird part is, even my doctor is amazed by it. Here's the crazy part. I'm not on some special diet. I'm not eating rabbit food. I'm not taking a cabinet full of supplements. I eat what I want. I live my life. And the biggest thing that changed wasn't a medication. It wasn't a diet. It wasn't some miracle treatment. The biggest thing that changed was the amount of chaos, stress, and turmoil I was carrying every day. Now, I'm not saying that stress causes every health problem. Of course not. That's ridiculous. And I'm not a doctor. And I'm definitely not telling anyone to stop taking medications. Don't do that. But what I'm telling you is what happened to me. And, what happened to me was real. The chaos was real. The health problems were very real. The medications were real. The heart problems were real. And the improvements after leaving that environment were real too. You know, at some point, I had to stop arguing with the evidence sitting right in front of me. Those doctors were right. I was wrong. Because here's what I understand now that I didn't understand then. Your body keeps score. You can tell yourself you're fine. You can tell yourself you're tough. You can tell yourself everybody has stress. And you can tell yourself you're handling it. But your body knows the truth. You know, your body knows when you're living in constant turmoil. Your body knows when you're walking on eggshells. Your body knows when you're carrying burdens that were never yours to carry. And eventually, it starts sending signals. The problem is, most of us ignore those signals. I did for many years. I ignore them because I thought being tough meant pushing through. I thought being a man meant enduring it. I thought if I just kept working harder, everything would be fine. I was wrong about that too. Because eventually the bill comes due. You're going to pay it. The body always collects. And if you're living in constant chaos, constant stress, constant conflict, you may be paying a price that you don't even realize yet. But you will. I promise you that. Looking back, I wish I would have listened sooner. And not because it would have saved me from every problem, but because, it might have saved me from some of them. Today my life isn't perfect. I still have challenges. I still have struggles. I still have bad days. I have worries. But I also have peace. And I don't think people fully understand how powerful peace really is. Peace isn't just good for your mind. Peace can save your life. I believe that because I've lived both sides of it. And, I've lived the chaos and I've lived what came after. And if I could go back and tell the younger version of myself one thing, it would be this: stop pretending constant turmoil is normal. Stop. Just stop. because it isn't. Stop pretending chaos doesn't have a cost, because it does. And stop assuming you're getting away with it, because sooner or later, that bill will come due. Mine did. Thankfully, I got another chance. Not everybody does. And that's exactly why I'm telling you this story now. You do what you want with it, but I'm telling you the truth. Y'all, I'll see you in the next one.